we're going to look back at the 1990s and say, wow, that was a great time. It was so peaceful. It's like, we didn't have any shocks. Everything was great. We didn't have a trade war. We didn't have a pandemic. We didn't have a thing that we haven't even had yet, like a, super volcano. It's like, wait for that one. Because, and it is unusual. I mean, like, having 10 years without a major crisis is like, wow. I mean, that was unusual. We thought that was normal. No, that was unusual. This is normal. When in fact we sort of take a broader time frame, we went out and asked people, it says, actually, how much of a disruption should you, expect since the 2000 in the last decade? Have you experienced? And we see this kind of thing, that every 5 years people get a 2+ month disruption in their production. And so that's, and that's currently now. And so some of these things are anticipable. When we say, how much can you anticipate this? Well, some things you could probably anticipate. Regulation, generally speaking, you can see where it's coming at, and you better have a scenario around it. A trade war, you can more or less anticipate that, and so there's some things you can do in advance. Some things you obviously can't. An acute climate event like a Fukushima, that's you can know that it might happen, but you're not exactly sure when or exactly where. Let alone a meteoroid strike. So not saying that everything has to be part of the planning process, but to recognize that this is a much riskier world than we thought it is. And with that, what we tried to do is to say, so which industry is riskiest? And what are they at risk for? But before I get there, let's say, what are we trying to achieve here? We are trying to get to a resilient state. We're trying to get to a state where we have visibility on all our risks. We sort of know what we're exposed to, that we are regularly stress testing, that we are sort of considering what is going on, and we are rethinking our supply chain approach. We are then moving, we are taking some actions to reduce that vulnerability, and finally that this is actually at the top of the agenda, that it's not something that is buried down somewhere in financial planning somewhere, but it's actually the CEO agenda. Because this scale of risk for us is a company killer. I mean, if you are out of the supply, if your supply chain is affected by one of these things directly, it will clearly, create a competitive disadvantage. So when we say risk, let me just disaggregate that for a moment. We mean, value chain risk is the shock times the vulnerability, which I could even say is like the shock times the exposure times the threshold. So vulnerability is like how much of your supply chain is exposed to something, and how much of a threshold do you have before you start to really take some damage. But the shocks are things like we said, the unexpected events. And when I just said we wanted to look at who's most exposed, we're actually looking at these things, saying, which industries are most likely to experience some of those force majeure events, macro-political, idiosyncratic. So these are the uncertainties that you experience. And then what are they doing about it in terms of reorganizing their planning and supplier network, their transportation and logistics, and right down through to the product itself and the supply chain. So, here you are, automotive. All right, so we've looked at 23 value chains, and these are them. Looking at their overall exposure to shocks, as we looked at it, and the good news, I think, for automotive is somewhere in the middle. It's not the worst, it's certainly, and it's not the best. And when we looked at shocks, we looked at these kind of things. We looked at pandemics, cyber attack, geophysical, climate, trade. These are all the different types of shocks that you could experience, and shocks both on the supply side and on the demand side. As I was saying, sometimes it starts on supply, rolls through to demand, becomes a financial shock. So for automotive, it's in the middle, number 14 out of 23. ICT is actually right at the top. Medical devices is actually was relatively immune. Mostly because of the location of production, the factors of the production, how labor intensive something is, for example, and the costs associated with it, or the specific countries that are involved in the geographic side. You can see trade dispute. So for us, when you're sort of looking at it, saying it's not as much about the climate in the case of the automotive chain overall, but there is quite a bit of pandemic shock, largely because of the demand side, sort of where the demand is focused, and the labor-intensive nature of a lot of the supply chain. Obviously, the U.S.-China thing gets you to the trade dispute. So that's just as an observation here. That translates for the average company to say that over a 10-year period, you would probably experience at least half of 1 year's earnings to be disrupted because of that kind of shock in the auto sector. So that it's essentially managing this shock is worth 40% of all industries' annual EBITDA, and for the industry of the auto industry is slightly more exposed, about 56%. So that's trying to put a number on it, saying doing better at managing the resilience is worth half a year's EBIT, half a year's EBITDA, sorry. That I think is kind of our sense of why this should be on the CEO's agenda and what companies can and should invest in those resilience measures to come out ahead financially. In other words, if you're managing this, you will be half a year's EBITDA better off than your competitor. So what are they doing? All right, first of all, there's diversifying the geographic footprint of the supply network. So clearly that's at the top, but almost everything else is about managing the supply chain itself. So like giving you what you have, how are you actually increasing transparency throughout it, working with your suppliers to make them more resilient, both operationally and financially, qualifying additional suppliers when you need to, and then bringing things more in-house, or in fact ultimately creating changes to the whole product. Obviously that is more longer term in most cases, but this type of resilience thinking is now what we've been seeing executives engage in across industries, and this of course is for the automotive sector itself.